Good morning, everybody. I hear a lot of energy out there. That's good. Might be because it's Friday. That's a good thing. It's going to be in the 70s today. Should be nice and warm. And then for those who want cold weather, 30s in the morning. So it's either way you want it. But well, welcome today. We are glad you're here again for our second day related to these special sessions. I do hope you enjoyed yesterday. I do want to mention that I hope you walked away knowing very clearly what Dr. West was trying to help us as a university to understand and that ideas have consequences. That when you undermine a Christian worldview that says all people are created in the image of God and have dignity, that when you remove that piece of the puzzle, it changes the way you will treat people and what you will do. And he was trying to make that clear through, obviously, looking at the examples of history. And I hope you walk away with that, because I hope that we are a campus that will exemplify that we treat all people with dignity and value, because all people are created in the image of God. And I hope we captured that yesterday. Well, let's pray together. We're praying for Angola again, and then we'll give you a few announcements and we'll introduce our speaker. Father, today we are once again just praying for the nation of Angola and pray, Lord, for the churches and the outreach. And Lord, I do know that false teaching that they've said is an issue there, and we pray for truth to go forward. Once again, as we did yesterday, we pray for pastors who can disciple and strengthen the body. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, a couple of quick announcements. Today, between your classes, it says stop by the Diamond at the Lions Athletic Complex to support our baseball team as they face off against Central Baptist in the doubleheader at 12 p.m. So go Lions for sure. 12 p.m. and 2:30, both. It's a doubleheader. So make sure and go and support our baseball team. All right? Absolutely. And then tonight, I know that we're always excited about the well. The well is happening tonight in McCaffrey Chop. Okay. Second floor of the admin building, doors open at 8 p.m., and we cannot wait to see you there. And let me just remind you, Jesus told the woman at the well that the Father is seeking those that would worship him in spirit and in truth. And so it should be a great night tonight. One other just reminder that if you don't know, there's a conference taking place tomorrow here in Dallas. It's a Science and Faith Conference. And you can go online to find out more information, but it's sponsored by the Discovery Institute. It's called The Privileged Planet: Intelligent Design on the Earth and Its Inhabitants. If you look at the names of the speakers, it's going to be a great conference. I will be there, my wife will be there, and we're really looking forward to it. Everyone is welcome to come, but please note, if you're not able to physically go, you also have the option to attend online. And it's a typical conference where there is main speakers, and then there are breakout sessions, so you have some choice what you might want to listen to. Anyway, it's going to be a great conference. I encourage you for that as well. All right. Well, let's get to why we're here today. Again, I'm very thankful that President Bridges has made this opportunity for us, because we need to be able to think about these issues that are impacting our world. And today, we have an incredible guest with us, Dr. Brian Miller, who serves as a research coordinator and senior fellow for the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. He holds a BS in physics with a minor in engineering from MIT and a PhD in physics from Duke University. He speaks internationally on the topics of intelligent design and the impact of worldviews on society, and he's contributed to multiple books and journals covering the debate over intelligent design. And students, I think you're going to be challenged today. Would you please give a warm welcome to Dr. Brian Miller.
It is really an honor and a pleasure speaking for you today, because you really are the future of our nation. And I just have heard so many wonderful things about how you're being trained to really honor God and honor Christ in the marketplace. And today I'll be speaking about really my favorite topic, and that's really how science points increasingly to a creator. And this is really an important topic to me, because when I was raised in church, but when I went to college, I was told that there's this terrible conflict between faith and science. So either you're a person of faith and you're kind of fluffy and you sort of believe things emotionally, or you're a person of science and you believe things because of evidence and reason. And I became pretty convinced that people that were Christian because it was just a psychological crutch. They just didn't know any better. They hadn't studied the evidence. And that was really discouraging to me, because I realized that if God didn't exist, and if we're just an accident of nature, then life really has no purpose, because it doesn't matter if I'm kind or cruel, if I'm happy or sad. Ultimately, I'll die and I'll cease to exist. My memories will be gone. And eventually our sun will explode and then everything will end. And those were very dark thoughts when I was in college, but that was kind of where I was. And I said, God, I don't know if you exist, but if you do exist, you have to prove it to me, because I'm a scientist. I didn't know if that was against the rules, if that was something that just, you weren't supposed to do, but I just said, God, that's the way it has to be. And what that did is it put me on a journey for many years where I studied science and philosophy, chemistry, biology. And what happened is, over my years, what I came to realize is that a little science will often pull people away from God, but a lot of science will bring them back. And that was sort of a famous quote attributed to many different people. And also, as I went through this journey, I realized this debate about faith and science is not something that was recent. It doesn't go back to Darwin or the Scopes trial. But if you go back to even as far back as 500 BC, to the ancient Greeks, they were debating the same thing. Because you had people like Democritus, who was a materialist. Oh, and when I say words like materialist or materialism, what I'm not talking about is people that like bling, people that like nice cars. When I say the term materialism or scientific materialism, I'm referring to people that believe all that there really is matter and energy, the laws of nature, and that they can explain everything. And that's what they believed in ancient Greece, because they were atomists, and they believed that everything in the universe was composed of microscopic atoms, and these atoms interacted according to certain rules, what we would call the laws of nature, and they believed that chance, time, and matter would eventually explain everything you see in the world. And then they were, of course, in competition. They debated people like Aristotle, like Plato, like Socrates, people who believed in design. And the ancient philosophers in that tradition believed that matter in of itself could not explain the order that we see in the universe, that there was a mind behind the universe, and that mind came up with blueprints, or what might be called forms, and then an intelligent agent shaped matter for a purpose, for a goal. And that's the debate that goes, again, back to the ancient Greeks. Now, what's fascinating is if you go to even the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, he said, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So what you see is the Apostle Paul was engaging the very same debate that started centuries earlier. In fact, at the time that Paul wrote his epistle to the Romans, you had the same debate with the Epicureans, and the Epicureans were not people that liked to cook good food, but they were the descendants of people like Democritus, who believed, again, everything was a product of chance, time, and the laws of nature. In fact, there was a poet, a Roman poet named Lucretius, and about the 1st century BC, he had a very primitive idea of natural selection. So he had this idea that different animal body parts would come together, and some wouldn't be very effective, so they would die, and then some would work effectively, so they would be selected to survive. So again, what happened is you really see the same debates today as you see back then. And of course, Paul was opposing the view of the materialists, and he was supporting the belief of the Stoics. And the Stoics in the 1st century had followed in the tradition of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and they believed that there was a mind behind the universe, and they believed the clearest evidence of design in creation was the human body in the human mind. Now, what happened is, over the next several centuries, you have the church that grew in prominence, and you had many church leaders, people like Athanasius, people like Irenaeus, of course, people like Aquinas. And what happened is the church leaders basically kept reaffirming this idea that when you look at nature, you see evidence of a mind and evidence of the Christian God. And they opposed the materialists of the ancient times that were also somewhat influential, but had largely died out. But that changed in the modern era, because what happened was when you have people like Isaac Newton and Kepler and Copernicus who started to realize that you could explain a lot that we see in nature through simple equations, that gave more credence to the materialist view. Now, of course, they were Christian, and they understood that the order that you saw in the world was because it was produced by God, by a mind. And they also knew that because we were created in God's image, we were given the ability to understand the order God created. And that's the great irony, is that there isn't a conflict between faith and science, but modern science was birthed largely by Christians because their faith directed them to understand the world, and their faith gave them the philosophical framework that allowed them to do science. Because you don't expect to study the order in the world if you don't believe there's a God who created an orderly world. So that's the great irony. Now, what's happened is that changed when it came to Charles Darwin. Because even after the people like Newton, Isaac Newton and Kepler, and they showed that there was order in the world, people still understood that when you look at biology, you see an order that is the direct result of a mind. It's like technology. Like if you have a car, you can talk about the physics of the rubber or the chemistry of the gasoline, but you can't explain the order in a car by the physics and chemistry of rubber, gasoline, metal, and glass. You can only explain the car because the mind created a blueprint that put those pieces together for a purpose. And you have people like William Paley, who was a natural philosopher, that made the same sorts of arguments, but he talked about watches as opposed to cars. Now, what Charles Darwin did is he changed everything. Because many people, when you read Charles Darwin's biography, and I assume you've all heard of Charles Darwin, correct? And when you read his biography, he portrayed himself as this honest explorer of truth. He was just looking at the evidence. But his biography didn't reveal his true beliefs, because his journals have been released relatively recently. And when you go to his journals, he talks about how he was strongly influenced by the materialist philosophers of his day, the free thinkers. Also, if you look at his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, he was deeply influenced by Lucretius, the Latin poet I told you about. And he actually wrote his own poem called The Temple of Nature, which promoted the same materialistic idea. So Charles Darwin is simply a product of the same philosophical tradition that went from Democritus to Lucretius to Epicurus, right down to Erasmus Darwin to Darwin himself. So when he looked at the evidence, he was looking at it through a certain template, a certain grid, a certain set of assumptions. So he assumed that life must be the product of natural processes, and he fit the data within that perspective. And what he did was he brought a real revolution in science. In fact, this is a famous quote. It's by one of the founders of the AAS, and he says, "It was Darwin's greatest accomplishment to show that the directive organization of living beings can be explained as the result of a natural process, natural selection, without any need to resort to a creator or other external agent." So what Darwin said is, you see what might look like design in biology, but it's an illusion, because it's not the designer, it's not a creator, but it's nature just acting like a designer. So the basic idea is, if you had like a bunch of mice, you had a fox, and let's say the ground was really dark, and you had some mice that were dark and some that were light, the fox would most likely eat the dark mice. So over time, the mice would grow lighter and lighter. So nature would be, in a sense, selecting for the light-colored mice. So mice would be directed by nature to become lighter color. That's the whole idea. And it's actually true. That basic idea is true. But what he did was he expanded that idea, where he said it's not just that a mouse can get lighter, but what happens is these small changes can accumulate over millions and millions of years into massive changes. So that eventually he came up with this idea of the tree of life, that if you have a cell that maybe formed a long time ago, it would become more complex, and natural selection would cause it to transform. and you'd have it branch into different branches where you have animals and plants, and the animals would branch in the different animals we see today. And eventually, the tips of the tree would be the species we have today, which would include us. But everything is connected through this tree of life, and it's all a product of blind, undirected natural processes, no need for a creator. So we essentially removed God from creation in a very real way. Now, what happened is the science was always questionable. They were always skeptics. But what happened is the philosophical winds were changing during that time period. So philosophers were increasingly wanting to understand the world without having to appeal to a creator. What happened was God was not seen as a source of truth, the source of wisdom, the source of our morality, of our purpose, but the center of focus went to humans, us. We became the measure of all things. It's about our logic, our reason, our beliefs, our observations. And what happened is people increasingly did not like this idea of a creator telling them what to do. In fact, here is a famous quote. It's by Aldous Huxley. And what's interesting about Aldous Huxley is he was the grandchild of Thomas Huxley. And Thomas Huxley was called Darwin's bulldog because he was promoting evolution aggressively. And Thomas Huxley, or Aldous Huxley, explains part of the motivation. He says, the philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with the problem in pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do. For himself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. So you see, this idea of removing God from creation meant that we could then define for ourselves what was good, what was right, what was true, and how we should live. And this philosophical shift was sort of the tailwind that helped evolution go from a theory, a speculative theory, to a sacred creation narrative. Evolution was seen as an icon of this new age where we could do what we wanted to do. We were not beholden to a creator. We were simply a product of the blind forces of nature, so we decide for ourselves morality and purpose and ethics. And what happened is today it's accepted as a sacred institution of Western culture. It cannot be questioned, regardless of the science. Now, what's interesting, though, is over the last several decades, and even earlier in the 20th century, the science has shifted. The evidence has increasingly shown that life in the universe and our planet are not just the products of blind chance. We're not just an accident of nature, but that there is a mind behind every aspect of our world. And part of it is with the laws of nature. What people have realized is when you study physics, which I hope you all do, it's absolutely wonderful, not that I'm biased, but you look at things like gravity. All these different forces and laws have certain parameters that define them. Like, how strong is gravity? Is it weak? Is it strong? Is it in between? And what happens is many of these parameters have to be carefully set, or our universe could not support life. If you were to create a random universe and set a lot of these details just by chance, it would be very unlikely you would choose a set of details where the universe could support life. I'll give you one example for sake of time, gravity. Imagine that you had a dial and you controlled gravity. You could turn it up, you would be heavier, you could turn it down, we would be lighter. You would have to set that dial with incredible precision for our universe to support life. It would be like if you shot a target that was 1 inch by 1 inch at the other end of our solar system. The precision needed to hit that target is the precision needed to set gravity so that our universe could support life. There's many other examples. Also, if you look at our planet, there are countless details of our planet, our sun, and our moon that have to be set just right, or else we could not support life. If we were too far from the sun, if our tilt wasn't right, if we didn't have a moon that stabilized our orbit, if we didn't have outer planets that protected us from meteorites, if the sun didn't produce the right amount of energy, if our atmosphere didn't allow the right energy in and out, we would not be able to live on this planet. So when you look at not just the laws of nature, but every detail of our moon, our sun, our planet, our solar system, you see the evidence of a designer that created it with us in mind. But what is perhaps the most exciting shift, where I find the most exciting evidence, is that of biology. Because what you find is, for decades, people who believe in the grand theory of evolution have presented certain pieces of evidence, things like biogeography, the fossil record, bacterial resistance to antibiotics. And they said this evidence shows beyond any shadow of a doubt that humans simply evolved from lower animals through a blind, undirected process. But what's interesting is, again, the evidence over the last 20 years has shown that every argument for the creative power of evolution is now based almost entirely on cherry-picking a few pieces of evidence that fits the theory, ignoring the evidence that doesn't, and circular reasoning. In other words, the evidence only seems impressive if you assume in the first place that evolution is true. Now, I could speak for many hours on this, but I'll give you one example, and that's the fossil record. Because this whole idea that the evidence of fossils, which are extinct animals, shows evolution is based on outdated science. Because the fossil record consistently shows that animals and plants and different organisms appear suddenly. And this picture I'm showing you is what's called a picture of the Cambrian explosion. And what happened is, when you look at the first representatives of a large number of the same animal body plans, the same animal types, things like a horseshoe crab, something like an echinoderm, something like a first fish, it appears suddenly out of nowhere and then doesn't change. And that's a consistent pattern. When something appears in the fossil record, it appears suddenly and then doesn't change significantly. So the fossil record completely opposes this idea that life is a product of a small, gradual process. Now, some of you might be thinking, but wait, I thought when I watched PBS or Nova or Discovery Channel, I saw these beautiful transitional species. Like, here's a wonderful picture. It's a picture that shows some ape-like creature that over time gradually evolved into a modern human. A powerful image. And it's so powerful because it's so inaccurate. Because when you talk to people who are experts in the field, paleontologists, people that are who specialized in human fossils and what are believed to be our ancestors, they'll tell you this is myth. What you see in the fossil record is you have ape-like creatures, and then there's a gap with human-like creatures. In a geological instant, you have these changes that take place. So you don't see this gradual development of an ape-like creature to a human, but it's more discontinuous. And what happens if you look at the mathematics, so if you just take every dating that they give at face value, they would say it took about 2 million years to go from an ape-like creature, an Australopithecine, to a human-like creature, like Homo erectus. Well, in that time period, if you run the math, and you look at the population size, if you needed, let's say, just 2 specific mutations for a new trait, it would take you over 100 million years to get those 2 mutations in an individual. 100 million years for 2 mutations that are specific and coordinated. But the entire time that ape-like creatures were believed to turn to humans is about 2 million years. Do you see a disconnect? So from a mathematical perspective, it is a theoretical impossibility for random mutations to produce the human mind, our ability to vocalize, upright posture, our incredibly dexterous hands. Now, there are many other problems. Another other problem is that if you look at mutations, every mutation that does anything significant, any mutation that would create the sort of changes you would need to turn, let's say, an amphibian into a reptile, or a mammal, a mouse into a human, the mutations that you would need to do that are always harmful. So if you talk to experts in the field, people like Eric Davidson or Charles Marshall, they would say that the sorts of mutations needed to create these large-scale changes can't happen today because they're always harmful. So what do? Oh, it's simple. They say biology in the past was completely different. Genetics in the past was completely different. So maybe life today can't evolve significantly, but in the past, it was completely different, so maybe it could have worked back then. But imagine if you were a geologist and you said, my theory is in complete contradiction to the evidence that we see, but that's okay because maybe the laws of nature were completely different in the past. Maybe with those laws it would have worked. That's a problem. But because the evolutionary framework is accepted as an undeniable fact, people allow this sort of wild speculation and ad hoc explanations. But what's interesting too is I want you to understand why this imagery is highly misleading. And I'm going to do it through an analogy. Imagine that humans evacuated Earth, and all they left behind is a bunch of trash. If you ever seen the movie WALL-E, you'll know what I'm talking about. So these aliens come and they explore these giant trash heaps, and they find lots and lots of artifacts, cars, washing machines, blenders. And one of the persons says, I think long ago there was an automated factory, and this factory had a program that ran it, but this program would go through mutations. So I believe every human artifact is a product of evolution. Maybe there was something simple, and through random mutations of this factory, it evolved into the tree of human artifacts we see today. And what they would do to prove this, oops, sorry, wrong way. What they would do is they say, look, we have these beautiful transitional artifacts. We've got a unicycle, a bicycle, a motorcycle, a car, and then a bus. An undeniable evolutionary transition going from a unicycle to a bus. And they'll even create these evolutionary trees. So they say, well, the car and the bus has 4 wheels, so therefore it has a common ancestor. That's where those lines come together, where 4 wheels first evolved. And of course, a motorcycle, a car, and a bus all have motors, so they're related through a common ancestor that had motors. Now, obviously, that makes no sense, right? Because what the aliens would eventually realize is those lines don't correspond to anything real. They're not series of artifacts slowly evolving. That you're simply imposing this tree structure where it doesn't belong. And it's the exact same thing with life. When you look at life, what you see is things appear suddenly and don't change. And yes, sure, you can occasionally put them in a linear progression, but that's because there are millions of fossils with dozens of traits, so inevitably, purely by chance, you can put them in a line sometimes. That means nothing. But the evidence shows that things appear suddenly and do not change. But if you look at all these challenges, what's happened is it's caused people to seriously question the theory that we have today. In fact, there was a conference in London called the Royal Society meeting, New Trends in Evolutionary Biology, and they came together because they realized that the evidence does not support the standard evolutionary model. The main speaker started by saying that neo-Darwinism, or we would just call it Darwinism, or this idea that mutations in natural selection can create these changes, is simply false. Evolution can do really small changes, but it can't do anything significant as they understood it. So these top-level evolutionary theorists said, we need to come up with something a bit different. We've got to come up with new ideas. But not one bit, and I was at this conference, by the way, and not one bit of evidence was presented that any theory, any extension, could do anything truly significant. Maybe if you had a salamander, you could add a digit to its hand, but that's about it. The theory is intellectually bankrupt. They have no mechanism. They have no framework. That's a serious, serious problem. But what's happened is there's also been a shift taking place because more and more engineers have started to work with biologists. And as engineers have worked with biologists, what you're seeing is that the fundamental assumptions of the field are slowly starting to change. Because what people used to believe is if life is just the product of some blind, undirected process, it should be very often non-functional. You should have these non-functional organs, what they call vestigial organs. It should be clumsy and it should be suboptimal. That was the expectation. So whenever a biologist would see something they didn't fully understand, like the appendix, or something like certain bones in our wrists, they'd say, well, I don't get that. I think it's poorly designed. So that's one of the most strong evidences that people say is there's so much bad design in the human body and in life. You've got your ACL that'll break, We've got a back that gets sore. And there's always this sort of hand waving of why life shows it's so badly designed. But as engineers have started to work in the field, what they've shown is one after another, what people originally thought was poor design, they eventually realized was optimally designed. And the reason that people thought it was badly designed is because they weren't trained as engineers. What happens, a good classic example, is if you look at the eye, it's interesting because the photoreceptors don't face forward like in an octopus, but they face backwards. So light has to go through certain tissues before it gets to the photoreceptor. And people said, that's a stupid design. It's just because of evolution, that it's just this historical process. But what people who said that didn't understand the biology. Because what happens is your photoreceptors use as much energy as any cell in your body, so they constantly shed what are called discs, which are where the photodetectors are. So what happens is if your photoreceptors face forward, all these shed discs would make you go blind and the photoreceptors would burn out. But they face backwards because they embed in tissue, and the tissue actually will shave off the burned out discs, which allows for the regeneration of those discs so that you could see. In addition, there's special cells that act like fiber optic cables that take the light directly to the photoreceptor. So here's a classic example of what I call the imperfection of the gaps argument, or the materialism of the gaps. When biologists don't understand something, they might say it looks badly designed, but as our knowledge increases, we see it's optimally designed. My other favorite example is with the human ankle and foot. There was a book written by an atheist named Nathan Lentz. And he said the body was filled with bad design. Like he said, our feet and our ankles had like useless bones that really didn't do anything. Well, there is an engineer named Stuart Burgess who works with us. And he wrote a beautiful paper. And what he did was he looked at everything that you use your foot for, everything from walking to squatting to running to walking on uneven ground. And what he showed was that the design of our ankle and foot is optimal for everything we have to do. It's exquisitely designed, and he's writing papers on how to copy the design of the human to make better prosthetic limbs and limbs for robots. So again, this is a massive shift taking place. So I'm working with engineers and biologists around the world, and we're helping to accelerate this revolution that's taking place. We're helping to show how looking at life from the perspective of engineering helps you to do better science. And one of the studies we're looking at is origin of life. And what's fascinating is if you read people like Steve Benner, who's one of the leading origin of life researchers in the world, he says, in this paper called Paradoxes of the Origin of Life, he says that everything we know about physics and chemistry and all our experiments suggest that the origin of life is impossible. Interesting, right? I mean, he's an atheist. He believes it happened through a natural process. But he recognizes that all the evidence says it shouldn't happen through a natural process. But beyond that, when I'm working on a project where we're looking at engineering principles of self-replication, like research that NASA has done trying to create self-replicating space probes, looking at people trying to create self-replicating robots. And when you compare that research to research on how simple a cell can be and still function, there's a convergence that's taking place. So that we can say with great confidence that any cell that will function, no matter how simple, has to have energy production, selective gateways, active transport, information processing, manufacturing, auto-assembly, automated repair, waste disposal, sensors, signal processing, actuators, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what you see is what life is a nanotechnology vessel, even the simplest cell, capable of all these things. So the evidence of design is so clear and so unambiguous that you would have to, as the Apostle Paul would say, suppress the truth. And again, that's important because the study of biology is not the study like a study of science, like chemistry or physics or geology. But the study of biology, what you're doing is you're reverse engineering a technology produced by a mind far greater than our own. That's what biology is. And the more we understand technology, the more we understand biology, the more that convergence is becoming increasingly clear. One of the great examples, another project we're working on, is adaptation. Because remember, Darwin's idea is that you've got a species, it has random mutations, or his idea was gemmules, changes, you have this variation, and the natural selection will cause something to change over time. So nature is the external agent shaping an organism to adapt to the environment. But what's clear from the evidence over the last 20 years is that picture is largely incorrect. It's much more like a tracking system. So if you buy a car, and that car is an automated car, it has a tracking system. When it drives, it's monitoring the environment, and when it senses danger, what it does is it will turn the wheel to evade the danger. It'll make a change. And that's what we see in life. Because if you look at classic examples of organisms that evolutionists thought showed amazing evidence of the standard evolutionary model, the evidence now has shown that their ideas were inaccurate. Here's an example of what are called cichlid fishes. If you go to Lake Victoria or different parts of the world, you have this example of a fish, a cichlid fish, that would go into the lake, and it would diversify over time, and over a certain amount of time, you'd literally have hundreds of what looked like different species of cichlid fish. And people said, what an amazing picture of evolution. But as it turns out, what's happening is not random mutations, but the fish is monitoring the environment. And when it senses a different food or a predator, there's internal mechanisms that change its body structure when it goes from a juvenile to an adult. So it's not undirected, it's not nature, it's pre-programming done by its creator. And you're seeing this picture over and over and over again. Here's another classic example, cavefish. And I thought, hey, here's a sure win for the standard evolutionary model. You've got a fish, it goes into a cave, it experiences mutations, the genes that control pigment break, and its eyes cease developing. Not entirely true. What they found is these fish actually monitor the environment. So if there's water that has a different conductivity, showing that it's in a cave, there's a signal that goes to development, and then it alters the fish so that it has a fainter color and smaller eyes to give more room for the brain to develop other senses, so it doesn't waste energy. If you take the fish out of the cave, put it back into a river, it turns bright color again. Again, not random mutations, but the fish was designed to adapt. And it's even in mutations, because people are realizing that mutations are not random, but there's what's called natural genetic engineering, where organisms are designed to sense the environment and they direct mutations in a certain way. Again, it points to design in an increasingly powerful way. But again, the last example I want to give is the issue of what's called systems engineering. Because another assumption about life is that it should look like a Rube Goldberg machine if you believe it just happened by chance. And a Rube Goldberg machine is an example here where you've got some really elaborate mechanism that does something like wipe your chin with a napkin. You've got lots of components put together. You've got like a spoon, a parrot, a clock, a rocket ship, all put together to create this really clumsy machine to do something in a very inefficient way. That's what life should look like, because if there's no design, it's just random mutations and selection, then life should be pretty clumsily designed. But that's what we see is the exact opposite. What we see is what looks more like systems engineering, where every detail of a system in life shows a mind planned everything in advance, knowing the end goal to ensure every system works with every subsystem in a coherent fashion. And now this is an interesting book. It's a book that talks about systems engineering. It was produced by NASA. And what we have are biologists who are systems engineers, and they're looking at biology and working with biologists, showing that when you look at life, you see the exact same logic that humans use, the same principles, the same concepts. So let me use an example. This is a picture of the human hearing system. And when a systems engineer looks at this, they know exactly what's going on. Because this system, what it has is a tympanic membrane. It experiences sound. The sound causes these lever arms in these small bones called ossicles to move. And then the sound energy is transmitted to what's called the cochlea. And this is a tube with a liquid and hair cells, that the hair cells move with the sound vibrations, and then that gets converted to an electrical signal that goes to the brain. Well, what do systems engineers care about? They think about things like interfaces. what you see in this is a beautiful design interface. Because what happens is when sound goes through air, it has a certain resistance to motion called impedance. And the impedance, or the resistance in air, is different than the impedance in the liquid in the cochlea. So what would happen normally is the sound from air would hit the cochlea, and then it would bounce off, and you'd lose all your energy. But what happens is these bones are perfectly engineered to have the right dimensions, the right lever arm, the right area of contact to match the impedance perfectly, so all of the energy from the air gets transmitted to the liquid to be sent to your brain. This has to be planned in advance. The evolutionary model is that you had one bone going from your sound receiver to your sound transmitter, and then what happened is that bone detached, then two other bones came into the same location, formed into the perfect size and shape with the right connectors to have modern hearing. Now that would literally take thousands of mutations that were carefully coordinated. The problem is, as soon as that one bone detached, the organism would go deaf. And it would not hear again until thousands of mutations later when everything was perfectly engineered. That is nonsense. And that's the challenge, is every evolutionary scenario practically, when you look at the details, collapses. But what's happened in Western culture is because we've been trained to see the world through the lens of a materialist philosophy, when your mind is trapped by that philosophy, you lose the intellectual freedom to critically evaluate the evidence. You are forced to suppress the evidence of design no matter how clear it is. It's like the Matrix. You're trapped in a false reality where you're being blinded from the truth. But what's happened is the evidence for design is becoming so clear and so unambiguous, it's becoming next to impossible to suppress it. And it's not just in individual organisms. It's in entire ecosystems where organisms are designed to interact with other organisms. In fact, even the ecosystems are designed to interact with our geological cycles. So plate tectonics, the water cycle, and ecological cycles are integrated to allow for a stable environment where everything appears to be designed in advance for a purpose. In fact, a lot of this design is amazing because it doesn't just allow us to live, but careful interactions between the ecological cycles and the geological cycles have allowed very interesting things to occur, like mineral ores. The fact that we have so many minerals that we can easily extract from the surface of our planet is because of the design behind biological systems that super concentrate things like uranium, things like precious metals, that allow us not just to live, but to advance technologically. So what you see in every area of science, from physics to chemistry, to the study of our planet, to biology, is the evidence of a mind that created us for a purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. You did a phenomenal job. As we did yesterday, we're going to allow you to ask questions, and he will respond to you. And we have microphones over here with Dr. Espinoza. We have Dr. Langston here and Dr. Reynolds over here. If you have any questions, could you please go to those microphones? Don't wait around, just come quickly to them, and they will allow you to speak into the microphone. Go ahead.
I'm perfectly comfortable just staring awkwardly at each other. That's great.
Okay. So basically, I just wanted to ask, I think that you made some amazing points, especially just on the evidence of design in the world, how it's becoming more and more recognized. basically what I'm wondering then is where you think the world is going to go from there. Because clearly we believe and we know the world is always going to push back. The world is never going to just say, okay, you're right, there's design. Do you have any guesses or hypotheses on where the world moves from here with these prevailing evidences?
That's a terrific question. And what you're seeing is that people are increasingly recognize that there's evidence of design in nature. But what's fascinating is there's a couple responses. One response is the same response of Lucretius, of Darwin, and that's to say the designer is natural selection and self-organization. And it's really amazing, like this, you see this in Origin of Life, because in Origin of Life, nothing is replicating. It's just like some soup. But they'll still appeal to natural selection even if nothing is replicating. So they invoke natural selection and self-organization, not as real processes, but as demigods, as creative agents. That's one approach. Others are going to more of a Platonic perspective, like maybe there's these forms that are built into nature. That's kind of like Einstein. Like he believed that there was design, but he was very uncomfortable with a personal God because of all the suffering he saw. So that's understandable. So a lot of people are appealing to more impersonal entities. Some are appealing to aliens, like the movie Prometheus, like this idea that maybe Earth was seeded by some alien race. So people are going to different directions, but the good news is other people are seeing the truth and it's transforming their lives. Like there was a professor named Günter Beckley. He was a paleontologist at the Stuttgart Natural History Museum. And what happened was he really mocked people that said they saw design in nature until he started to read the books. And then he realized that, yeah, this design thing makes sense. And what happened was he put on his Facebook, yeah, I think there's evidence of design. And as soon as he said that, his supervisor said, well, you have to leave because you no longer share our worldview. That's very powerful, right? So that's what's happening. And he went on a multi-year journey and eventually became a Christian. So what you're finding is the evidence of design is breaking people free from the mental blinders of a materialist philosophy so they then have the freedom to explore the truth. It's not just natural, it's partly supernatural. Because Paul talks about, like in 2 Corinthians 10, about how we wage war not with human weapons, but weapons with divine power. And we cast down strongholds. He's talking in very spiritual realms, but then he talks about how we cast down arguments. I remember talking to a student who was an atheist at Duke, and you're getting to one of those arguments where someone kind of digs in and you know you're going to be there for like an hour. Well, after 2 minutes, it's like scales fell from her eyes, and she says, everything you say makes sense, and she became a Christian. So again, what you find is that when you present the truth of design, yes, there's opposition, yes, there's rationalization, but what the truth does is it frees people's minds, and some of them will go all the way to a creator. So that's what I'm seeing.
So how can we relate this to someone like overseas who may not completely understand like Western science?
Well, you have to understand, globalization is everywhere. So I was in Mumbai, India. I was in Guangzhou. I've been to countless countries. And when you talk to university students, they're shockingly similar. Like when I was talking to these students in Mumbai, it was like talking to students in New York City. So the globalization has caused the basic scientific knowledge to become fairly prevalent. So I'm finding I'm not having any trouble in major cities. But even if you go to villages, even if you go to places that are more remote, it's even easier because we were designed to be able to detect design. So it's natural. They'll just go along with it. What happens in Western culture is you've got a narrative, a false reality that's projected over people's minds. So it essentially creates what I would describe as a socially induced psychosis where they unconsciously suppress the evidence. So a lot of what we do is we simply give people high-powered glasses that gives them better vision to help them break through those blinders. So it's even easier when you get outside of the Western culture.
So how do you explain to people like the creation of like the other planets in the solar system and all the galaxies and black holes? Like, how would you explain that in terms of like creation?
Oh, great question. So how do I explain the galaxies, the planets, and everything? And there's different ways people go about this. You've got a lot of Christians who, for very thoughtful reasons, would look at Genesis from a sort of a literal 6-day creation. So this would be different days of creations. Other people would look at the days of longer periods of time where God allowed natural processes to carry out his will. So there's different takes on that. But whatever your take is, what's absolutely clear is when you look at the laws of nature, when you look at the details of our universe, you cannot have planets that support life. You cannot have a solar system that supports life like ours unless there was a mind behind it that planned everything in advance. That's absolutely clear. And then the mechanisms and the details, people can differ of exactly how it happened. But however much it was direct intervention by God versus God allowing certain natural processes to run their course, it's all clearly a mind behind the final result. So that's very easy to demonstrate. I typically just focus on the final result and the evidence of the mind at that point.
So I attended a science class in the past, and one of the topics was you have like the pillars of science, right? Like the whole belief, like if you have any religious ideas, your science is unfactual and it can't exist.
Right.
Because it's like, not like, I don't know, how would you word that? Like not,
Rational, not scientific, not, yeah.
how do you kindly refute that?
Great question. And the way I oppose this idea that you can't bring religion into science, there's a couple responses to that. One is everyone brings their philosophy into science. There is no such thing as a neutral science. It always is founded by a philosophy. So modern science was founded by a very Christian philosophy. This idea that there's a creator, that the universe is orderly. We are created with the ability to understand that order because we are creating in God's image, and we are commissioned to understand the order to advance in the world. So it was very much this religious foundation that allowed for science. Now, if you assume that everything is just by chance, if you assume our brains just evolve through random mutations, why would you believe that our brain would evolve to understand the way the Earth goes around the sun? That makes no sense. That has no survival ability. So you have to bring these religious, philosophical assumptions to even start to be able to do science. The second response is the study of biology is not like the study of physics, chemistry, or geology. The study of biology is reverse engineering a technology more advanced than our own. So what happens is you have to look at it from a design perspective to make progress. And you see that in the biological literature. They're bringing in engineering principles, engineering terms, design assumptions. It's just at the end of the day, they won't acknowledge the design. They say life looks like a cat, it smells like a cat, it walks like a cat, but it's really a duck. That's kind of what's going on. But let me use an analogy to really bring this home. Imagine that a spaceship crashes in Area 51. You have two groups of researchers. One group assumes it was produced by natural processes. So they say, well, let's look at how volcanoes could produce molten metal. The metal could go into the crevices of rocks and form spaceship parts. Then earthquakes and tornadoes could bring all the spaceship parts together to form a spaceship. How much progress would they make understanding the spaceship? Virtually none. But if another group of researchers said, I believe the spaceship is designed, what would they do? They would look at engineering principles, engineering patterns, engineering motifs. They'd look at the logic, the top-down design principles, and they would make enormous progress. It's the same thing in biology. The more people assume it was an accident, the more they're led off track. They assume things are poorly designed when they really aren't. They assume that there shouldn't be a high-level design when there is. They assume it shouldn't look like human engineering when it does. But the more people bring a design perspective into the framework, the more they can advance the field. Now, this pendulum I talked about, going from materialism to design, this takes centuries sometimes. So we're in the earliest stages of this shift. The old guard are not in a place where they're willing to accept the change. So our hope is people like you can go into the profession where your philosophical framework allows you to pursue the truth, and then over a few generations, the shift will go much further. That's our hope.
So you've made like wonderful, beautiful points. The only one that's left in my mind is like the question of carbon dating. So I've talked to like a lot of evolutionists personally, and they
Sure.
always point to
Sure.
like dating methods, and they always point to that. What would you say to that?
Sure, and again, as I mentioned before, there's different perspectives. You have more of a traditional young Earth perspective where it's a literal 6 days of creation, people like Institute of Creation Research, which I think is fairly close to us, and they would argue there's certain issues with that. And then you have more folks that would argue that the days of Genesis could be seen as older periods of time, so they'd be perfectly comfortable with the carbon dating. I tend to go more towards the old Earth side, but I have colleagues and friends that would be more on the young Earth side. So that's an issue we can honestly wrestle with in-house and be charitable about different perspectives. So if I were from the young Earth perspective, what I would say is that the old Earth perspective has a very strong argument, but that's because they have more scientists, more funding. So the young Earth community hopes that with time, with advances, they could explain the science from that perspective just as well. That's their hope. So that's kind of where the debate is in that context. Yes?
Hi. I was just wondering if we wanted to do more research on this on our own, what would be some good resources to do that?
Oh, excellent. So the question is, what about other resources? Well, we have a website. It's called intelligentdesign.org. That's intelligentdesign.org, and we've got videos, we've got articles, we've got links to tutorials, so that's a great place to start. If you go to discovery.org, you've got the Center for Science and Culture, there's more resources there. And then if any of you really want to become scientists, we've got a summer seminars. So we train people for a week in a beautiful area of Colorado. And that's where you get really advanced training. And that's if you really want to become a professor or a researcher. So those would be great places to start. I've helped with the book, Return of the God Hypothesis. There's another book Stephen Meyer has on signature in the cell, Darwin's doubt. These are all on our website. So there's lots of great books and resources. So intelligentdesign.org and discovery.org. Great place to go.
Hi. You mentioned earlier, as design becomes increasingly supported by modern science, people will turn to other explanations, such as aliens, to be the mind behind it. What evidence refutes that claim, and is there a way that we can kindly and conscientiously point to a creator?
Oh, that's a great question. Wow, you guys are wonderful. What happens is if you're just talking about design on Earth, it could be God, it could be aliens, but when you combine all the evidence of design, because what you see in our universe is the laws of nature were designed with life in mind. So aliens can't create the laws of physics that they're governed by. So when you look at the totality of evidence of the laws of nature, which points to a transcendent mind, and the evidence in biology, which points to a mind that's active in the world, that narrows the playing field quite a bit to the monotheistic religions. So that's how I'd approach it. Great questions.
Let's go ahead and thank our guests. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Some of you may be sitting there thinking, what's this got to do with me? I'm not a scientist, and so forth and so on. I think what you've heard in the last 2 days is it has everything to do with us in the sense that there are some of even people in this room who want to live life according to your own rules and regulations. You want to be your own boss. You want to do the things. You don't want to have any control. And that's really what the people who argue against intelligence design are saying. You've heard that today. But if indeed you do believe that there is an intelligent mind, and that intelligent mind behind creation is God, then we have the natural reaction is we now need to submit to that God. We need to allow that God who designed us to have control of us. And you all know that that intelligent mind gave us his son, Jesus Christ, to allow us to live in the freedom and in the joy and in the excitement that comes with having a reaction with that intelligent designer. And I just want to encourage you today to think about the words that we've heard in both yesterday and today. And even though you may not be a scientist, you may not even think in those terms, let what was said to germinate in your mind to have you ask the question, do I believe that there was a mind? What do I believe there was a designer? Do I really believe there is a God? And if I do believe there's a God, what does that mean for the decisions I make in my life? That said, thank you again for great interest, great questions, and we really appreciate our guests from yesterday and today. Give them one more round of applause, and you are dismissed.